What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and do you remember where you were when you first saw this video? If you were on MySpace back in 2008, you probably do, because this is a video that absolutely everybody was talking about, because nobody had heard or seen really anything like that. And yes, that video is, of course, ridiculous in hindsight, but it was the breakout moment for what I think is one of the most interesting musical movements of the past 15 or 20 years, the CRUNKCORE scene. Brokencyde and Millionaires would probably be the two biggest names that you might be familiar with. And look, let's be real. Most of this was not what you would call good music, especially in hindsight, but looking back, it's actually kind of mind-blowing how ahead of the curve it was. That CRUNKCORE laid the foundation for so many trends that are now a huge part of alternative culture. So what happened? And what is its legacy today? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you get all my videos. And also, I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. You guys know that I'm a huge believer in self-improvement and self-education and building the skills that you need to bring your ideas to life, and Skillshare is a great way to do exactly that. But what a lot of you may not know is that I've actually worked in online education as my day job for the last 7 years, and I sincerely believe in Skillshare. This stuff can and will change your life if you actually put in the work. There's tons of content to explore, real projects to create, and also, very importantly, the support of fellow creatives. And I could go on forever about all the great classes they have, but just a few that I personally suggest are Gary Vaynerchuk's social media class. Honestly, I don't think that I would be here doing what I am now without some of the things that I've learned from him about social media. Also, Rand Fishkin's Introduction to SEO. He's kind of like the Tony Hawk of SEO and just generally an incredibly insightful guy. And also Jessica Hish's Hand Lettering for Designers. She's one of the absolute best in the game at hand lettering, and I love learning from her. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable. If you get an annual subscription, it actually works out to less than $10 a month. And the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. First of all, for anybody asking, like, okay, wait a minute, what the hell is CRUNKCORE? Well, it's actually kind of exactly what you would guess from the name. Basically just Warped Tour scene kids doing their version of like mainstream party rap. Imagine a Lil Jon song with like post-hardcore style screaming in it, and that's pretty much CRUNKCORE. My personal introduction to CRUNKCORE was probably the same as 99% of you watching this. The video that I mentioned before for the Brokencyde song Freaxxx with 3 X's. Just like most of you probably, someone sent me this and I was like, what the fuck is this? But unlike most people, I didn't hate it. I was intrigued. Now, to be fair, I was partying a lot back then, so it's very likely that I was under the influence of one or more drugs when I heard it, and that may be a factor in why I liked it. I don't know. And of course, just like with everybody else, part of the appeal there to me was just like the WTF factor. Like, what is this? Where did it come from? Who are these kids? What is going on here? So I looked them up on MySpace and Last.fm and whatever, and I realized that actually there was kind of a whole scene of this stuff. And I think you can kind of divide the CRUNKCORE scene up into a few different distinct flavors. First of all, the like pure CRUNKCORE flavor, the people doing basically the same thing as Brokencyde of crunk rap with screaming. This was not a huge scene by any means, but a couple names that should be mentioned are Curve, dropping A Popped Locket, Trap House Rave, can't forget Family Force 5, the Christian CRUNKCORE band. Go to windshield, feeling so fly. This is how we do it, goes right. I would also include Hollywood Undead here, although I know some people don't. But to me, their early stuff is like the exact definition of scene kids doing edgy party rap. And I would say that they were my personal favorite CRUNKCORE artists. Like I said, I was partying a lot back then and I had a friend that was super into them, so I'm not proud of this, but I spent many nights getting wasted with that album playing in the background, and so I know pretty much every word to every song on Swan Songs. Wake up, grab beer, grab rear, shave beard, put on some And the second flavor of crunkcore would be the pop flavor, which sounded more like, I don't know, an edgier version of, say, Metro Station, that kind of like electronic pop that was really popular at the time. The biggest name here would be Millionaires, who I would argue might actually be the biggest name in the whole genre. And I was obviously not the target audience for them, but I thought what they were doing was really fun. Kind of reminded me of like an updated version of the electroclash artists from the early 2000s, like Avenue D. And I just really like how much they antagonized that like music critic gatekeeper kind of crowd just by making what was really very innocuous party music for scene girls. And to me, it was all more or less part of the same phenomenon of scene kids doing their own edgy version of the mainstream party music that was popular at the time.
Yeah, we're getting pretty trash, but these boys ain't getting any ass.
Which brings us to part 2, the rise. For a while, it seemed like crunkcore might be the next big thing. I mean, you can understand why it would be, right? It's party music. And as I've mentioned in my other videos, people do like fun. Brokencyde and Millionaires were getting massive amounts of press coverage. Most of it along the lines of some jaded hipster breathlessly typing a headline like, "We just found the worst band of all time." But still, they were getting a ton of attention, and that is always a good sign. And honestly, they were doing big numbers for an unsigned artist by any standard. Millions of plays on MySpace and YouTube back when a million plays on a song was a lot. And Melissa from Millionaires was one of the most popular scene queens on MySpace at the time. Essentially the template for what we would think of as an influencer now, but we didn't have a word for it back then. She had like thousands and thousands of girls all over the world following her basically for her personal style and trying to be her. Hollywood Undead were also getting a lot of buzz. As I recall, they were supposed to be the first band on MySpace Records, but that just never happened for whatever reason. But they did sign to a major label, put out their first album, Swan Songs, which ended up actually going platinum. And Brokencyde got on the MTV show TRL, which to this day is still bizarre to think about that happened. And so it was plausible to think that one of them might have some kind of like breakout hit. Remember, this is when stuff like Kesha 303 and LMFAO was really popular. So it wasn't crazy to think that, say, Millionaires could have a huge song, especially considering that like Kesha pretty much copied her whole style and sound from them. But it just kind of never happened. Brokencyde and Millionaires kept making music, but seemed like people just sort of lost interest in it. Hollywood Undead kept going and did well, but they had turned into more of like a nu metal-y butt rock kind of band. And the genre as a whole was kind of over by, I would say, like 2010 or so. And as for why it died, well, the answer is pretty simple. As cool as it was in a lot of ways, like the honest truth is just that it was not very good for the most part. Like 99% of it was almost unlistenable.
Garbage man, pussy ass, bitch ass, dick in a booty ass, take my dick.
That was really only gonna appeal to like edgy 14-year-old MySpace kids. And so as soon as those kids moved on to the next thing, once the novelty of crunkcore wore off, it was just kind of over. Although, as I'll talk about in a minute, I think it left a bigger impact than most people realize. Which brings us to part 3. So what exactly was so cool about crunkcore? Why did you make this video? First of all, like I said in the beginning, it was very clearly an outsider art movement, which is kind of a douchey term from like the fine art world, but I think it actually describes crunkcore perfectly. Outsider art is art by self-taught or naive art makers. Typically, those labeled as outsider artists have little or no contact with the mainstream art world or art institutions. That sounds to me like the description of a whole lot of the most interesting movements in alternative music. For example, early punk and black metal. And I've always been drawn to the kind of energy of those movements because that is where you find the true free thinkers. The people who really just do whatever they want with their art with no regard to what the quote-unquote rules are, which is exactly why all the critics and media gatekeepers hated crunkcore. These were kids from out of the way, uncool places like Evansville and Albuquerque who broke all the rules established by these gatekeepers because they didn't even know what the rules were, much less give a shit about following them. For one, they combined two genres of music that critics have always hated: party rap or pop and scene music. The critics hated Lil Jon and Suicide Silence, so when Brokencyde combined them together into one kind of music, that was just too much for the critics to handle. Now, the basic idea of combining rap and alternative music, that was fine. I mean, these critics all love Beastie Boys and Faith No More, for example, or early alternative rap like Atmosphere or whatever. But party rap? That is against the rules. You're not allowed to have fun. This is part of the reason why they hated Limp Bizkit too, because a big part of Limp Bizkit was being party music. I sometimes like to call those people the No Fun Club because they seem to get really upset by music that people can use as the soundtrack for fun. For example, mainstream pop, pop country, EDM, or any of that mainstream party rap. And CRUNKCORE was basically just the scene kid version of Lil Jon, Katy Perry, or Calvin Harris. And the second rule that they broke was that they weren't really bands in the traditional sense. Most of them didn't actually play instruments. They just rapped or screamed over like GarageBand loops, which personally I thought was really cool, even if it didn't like sound quote unquote good. They just wanted to make music, so they worked with what they had, right? And what is more punk than that? And the third rule that they broke is that they just completely sidestepped the entire music industry, at least at first. They did DIY home recordings way before that was popular. Like I did a podcast with Melissa from Millionaires, and she was talking about how her and her sister did those songs like on the desktop PC in like their living room that they shared with the whole family. And then they distributed those like super raw DIY recordings themselves on MySpace and DatPiff and whatever else was around back then, going around all the blogs and stuff who were used to being the gatekeepers of power for promoting new music. And like I said earlier, put up pretty big numbers. They were getting millions of plays in a time where streaming wasn't even a word. Certainly it was a fraction of what it is today. And I think the fact that they just sidestepped all the existing power players in the industry was part of why those same people reacted so negatively to them, because their power was threatened.
What's the big dealio? Okay, oh my God. What the fuck?
And that playbook is obviously very common now, but remember, this was over a decade ago, almost 15 years ago now. Even something as simple as putting out mixtapes was a very new idea back then, at least in the context of alternative music. Like, mixtapes were a rap thing. Rock bands didn't do that, but the CRUNKCORE kids did because why the fuck not? Like, it never occurred to them to stop and check the list of rules as to whether they were allowed to do that or not. And so if you think about it, what they were doing in like 2007 to 2009 was the blueprint for being a DIY musician today. And if you just kind of zoom out a little bit, if current alternative music culture is defined by extremely online kids making weird shit in their bedrooms and sharing it on like kind of semi-underground obscure corners of the internet and then blowing the fuck up, meanwhile all the adults are shitting on everything that they do, well, that's what CRUNKCORE was. And another thing I've talked about recently is this seemingly new model where the artist is an internet personality or influencer as much as they are a musician. For example, Jaden, Corpse, and Lil Huddy. Well, that's not actually a new idea at all. Melissa from Millionaires was doing that in 2008. Now, all of that being said, I also have to point out some parts of the CRUNKCORE scene that did not age well and in hindsight was kind of not cool. Number one is the existence and popularity of Blood on the Dance Floor. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I think probably most people are familiar with this, but they were a big part of that scene. And to make a long story short, there have been a lot of very serious, troubling allegations against the main guy from Blood on the Dance Floor, Davi Vanity. You can look them up yourself if you want more detail, but basically, this guy seems like he is a complete piece of shit human, and it's kind of a black eye on the scene that he was such a big part of it. There was also a lot of lyrical content that in hindsight really did not age well and was not cool, especially considering that such a large part of the fan base was really young girls. For example, or my personal favorite moment of CRUNKCORE cringe, this song, which at first seems to be a corny, shitty, but harmless kind of love song, except that he says the N-word not once, but 3 times. Which brings us to the last section. What exactly is the legacy of CRUNKCORE? I'll say this. I think there are very few artists now who, if you asked them, would say that their influences were Brokencyde, Curve, Millionaires, and Hollywood Undead. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore that a lot of current alternative music and fashion is very similar to what CRUNKCORE artists did back in the late 2000s. For example, look at this guy. You tell me. CRUNKCORE artist from 2008 or famous e-boy TikToker from 2021. You can say what you want about how cringe this is. Obviously it's ridiculous, but I would say the CRUNKCORE artists were the peak of like the scene look from an aesthetic perspective. And that is back in a big way on alternative TikTok. Or listen to this Brokencyde song from 2007. To me, that is very, very clearly the blueprint for the trap metal stuff that started coming out around like 2014 or so. For example, and a lot of people have pointed out before how similar Kesha's early stuff was to Millionaires, and I have to agree. Whether that's a conscious copy of them or not, I don't know, but they definitely do sound very, very similar. And for better or worse, this is also the scene that launched the career of Jeffree Star. I remember him as the guy who rapped about sucking dick on an early Hollywood Undead song.
This is Jeffree fucking Star, and this is a big fuck you to tell your jealous bitches to get mad that I'm fucking your boyfriends.
But he's gone on to become one of the most popular, powerful influencers in the beauty world, and he's probably worth a couple $100 million now. And maybe the biggest connection to make to current music is hyperpop. A lot of people have compared 100 gecs to Brokencyde, and I actually agree with Anthony Fantano's take on this. I don't really think there's a super strong connection there.
I mean, this is as silly as saying a group like City Morgue is heavily influenced by Limp Bizkit.
But still, I think it's cool to see that hipsters have finally come around, that even Vice is defending the honor of Brokencyde. Welcome aboard, Vice. You're only 12 to 14 years late, as usual. But broadly speaking, I would say that CRUNKCORE laid the foundation for hyperpop. I mean, listen to this Scene Kids song from 2008. That could 100% be on some hipster-approved hyperpop playlist from 2021. And it does seem like there are some younger artists who want to bring the CRUNKCORE thing back. For example, this artist, who I think is called Punk in Love, that looks and sounds straight out of 2007. So although CRUNKCORE never really made it out of that short-lived moment of the late 2000s, I do think it left an impact. And like I said earlier, I think it might be the last time that we saw like a true outsider art movement in alternative music. When I've mentioned this before, people pointed to hyperpop as the current example of that, but I don't really agree. I think hyperpop is awesome. I really like what those artists are doing, but they are most definitely insiders. The same type of critics who hated CRUNKCORE love hyperpop, and those artists are very self-aware. They know exactly what they're doing, which is not a bad thing at all or criticism. I just think that takes them out of the discussion of being outsiders, which kind of raises the larger question of, is outsider art even possible anymore? Can anyone really be an outsider? If the definition is those labeled as outsider artists have little or no contact with the mainstream art world or art institutions, I'm not sure it's even possible to be an outsider anymore. I mean, with social media being what it is, everybody knows everything about everything. Like there's some kid who lives in some shit kicker little town in the middle of Minnesota or whatever who knows everything that there is to know about every cool new hypebeast sneaker drop because he spends all day on the internet researching it. He may live in the middle of nowhere, but he's not an outsider. I kind of feel like the days of outsider art are over, but I don't know, I hope I'm wrong, because the coolest stuff often comes from those outsiders. And if the last true moment of outsider art in alternative culture was Jeffree Star rapping about sucking dick in a Hollywood Undead song, well, that would be kind of an odd note to end on. Alright my friends, that does it for this video about CRUNKCORE. As always, I would love to know what you think in the comments. In particular about the legacy part and about any new artists who are really doing that like vintage style CRUNKCORE. If there's any of those, I would love to hear about them. Before I let you go, also I wanted to mention the Punk Rock NBA podcast. I did awesome podcasts with Melissa from Millionaires and Michael from Brokencyde, where we talk in detail about a lot of the stuff I mentioned in this video, like Brokencyde being on TRL and stuff. So if you are interested in that, you can check that out at the link in the description. Also, I wanted to mention my new merch, like this neon cartoon monster shirt that will take you right back to the good old days of MySpace in 2009. There's a link to that in the description as well. And of course, as always, I want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. It is because of your support that we're able to do a lot of things. For example, the podcast, that's how I pay our producer and editor. So thank you very much for your support. I am sincerely grateful. Patrons get every podcast early. There's a cool members only private Discord server. There's a way to have me review your music or art or podcast or anything else you want me to check out. So if that sounds cool, check out the link to our Patreon in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.